Usually.
Mortally offended. Hi, how are you? Looks great. Okay, I can't keep going then. Um, alright, this is it, y'all. You've suffered through me all this way. You're almost free. This is the last video. The last video I'll ever make. No, sorry. Um, last video for this class. So, rock and roll. This is about the transition to the Renaissance from the High Middle Ages. And so let's just bebop on along and get started so we can get finished. Okay. So, just to set some context, once again, you know, I like to repeat myself because there's nothing I love more than Morgan. But second, it's hearing myself talk. And then the cats. Maybe fourth would be chocolate or Shira. Fifth would be the other one. Sixth might be Real Genius. Great movie from the early 80s. Seventh.
Why?
What?
Why?
I was waiting for Morgan to stop me, but they're just watching. Um, anyway. Um, okay. To set some context, we've been talking about the medieval period, which runs from roughly 500 CE to roughly 1500 CE. We're going to talk about that here in a second. Um, the medieval period is characterized primarily by feudalism. When Rome, Western Roman Empire collapsed in the late 5th century, the power vacuum left by that was filled by a bunch of local dudes with swords who took over their little territory of land and immediately started fighting with their neighbors over their little territories of land. And that's feudalism. Um, Dispersed power structure. Oh, power is dispersed among a warrior class that runs everything by dint of violence. So violence is endemic to the system. Um, Localism is a characteristic of feudalism, and therefore reduced trade, um, and therefore reduced urban populations. Uh, and the lack of a public sphere and public institutions, because again, no real government, just a local thug with a sword. Lack of the rule of law, again, local thug with a sword can do whatever he wants because he's got all the swords, him and his buddies. They're not exactly drawing up a constitution, and they're certainly not accountable um, to anything except violence. So that's feudalism, which is the big characteristic feature of medieval society. Feudalism is the rule during it is the thing that is very very common throughout the first part of the medieval era, which I am referring to as the Dark Ages, as has been common through a lot of medieval historical scholarship. It's less popular to call that the Dark Ages now, um, but we're still going to use it for simplicity's sake. Things started to change in around the 9th century with Charlemagne, who made an attempt to make Europe less strictly feudal, and drag it back into a centralized government with the rule of law and things like that. He only held it together for about 14 years, and then it all went to hell when he died. Then the church in uh, in the 10th and 11th century started to get itself together, really unify uh, unify the church structure and uh, gain its independence not only from the local lords but also uh, from the Eastern Church. And in the 11th century, with the Crusades, it even managed to exert authority over the temporal lords, the non religious lords, the guys with swords of Europe. That, as well as the Crusades and the beginnings, the foundation of universities in Europe, of the founding of the Kingdom of England by William the Conqueror. Those are all vernacular literature. Um, the advent of a code of chivalry. All those things sort of mark a turning point of the Middle Ages into the High Middle Ages. Around 1100 to 1200 was the transition period. And in the High Middle Ages, which lasts from about 1200 to 1450-ish, again, we're going to talk about that in a minute, Europe is gradually becoming less feudal because it is basically gaining control over the chaos of feudalism, which resulted after the fall of the Roman Empire. So basically, the classical period ends with the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. There's anarchy and chaos and feudalism for a while. Bit by bit, different pieces of Europe start to take on characteristics that are less feudal or less local, less disorganized, so on and so forth. In the High Middle Ages, this process accelerates, and all of the main characteristics of feudalism start to go away. The ruling warrior class becomes less warriory. Give me a break. Morgan objects to the term warriory. Rightly so, but, but the ruling warrior class becomes less warriory. I'm not going to stop saying it. Less warriory. We get more centralized governments with bureaucratic institutions. In England and France, at least, over the course of the 100 Years' War. We get the return of the development of more cultural products, an intellectual culture and an artistic culture that's more advanced and sophisticated, which is a sign that the Dark Ages, ended and the medieval era is on its way out. Basically, the Dark Age has ended just like the Iliad marked the end of the Dark Age in Greece after the Bronze Age collapse. The development of universities, vernacular literature, Gothic architecture, and all this stuff marks the end of the Dark Age in Europe, a Dark Age that began after the collapse of Rome. And then we're left with a society that is no longer in a Dark Age, but which still has a social organization system that developed during a dark age, which is, say, feudalism. And so that period from about 1200 to about 1450 is a period where society is becoming less feudal. It's less aptly described by calling it feudal because it's less and less being run by a warrior class, a class that has trappings of a warrior class, but they aren't actually doing the heavy lifting in fights. It's becoming less and less local because we have centralized governments that are developing. The centralized governments have bureaucratic institutions which constitute a public sphere and operate by the rule of law. So that's coming back. The fact that we have less violence or less uncontrolled violence, and the rule of law means that trade is on the rise again. Trade being on the rise again means that urban populations are on the rise again. Basically, everything is trending away from the patterns of society in the Dark Ages, and eventually it's going to trend far enough away that we're just going to stop calling it the medieval era entirely. I'll return to this in a moment to clarify that. And so that's when we get the Renaissance. Okay, so let's talk about what the Renaissance is, when it happened, stuff like that. Why it happened. Okay. So the Renaissance is, when we're talking about the Renaissance, coming after the medieval era, we're talking about technically the Italian Renaissance, and it's the next phase after the Middle Ages. Basically, like I said, we mark the end of the classical era with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. We call that the end of one era and then the beginning of the medieval era or the Middle Ages, because everything in society after the fall of Rome was so different from the way it was when Rome was still a thing. So it makes sense to designate this as a different time period, a different era. The name is just there to sort of chop up, to get our head around the idea that things had really changed a whole bunch. It's the same way with the Renaissance. The Middle Ages were characterized by the feudalism that took hold after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, but in the High Middle Ages, Europe was becoming less feudal in character. We just talked about that. Feudalism is marked by localism, and the power and culture in Europe was becoming less local. Feudalism is marked by limited trade in the urban population, and the urban population was growing again, and trade was on an upswing. And feudalism is marked by a warrior class that runs everything, and as we said, the class that was running everything was becoming less warriory. So if we give the Middle Ages a different name from the era that came before it, the classical era, because society had become feudal in nature, then when society is no longer so very feudal in nature, it makes sense to say that we're in yet another era, a new era of European history, a different one than came before. It makes sense that eventually European society would change so much from its feudal beginnings in the aftermath of Roman collapse that the Middle Ages gives way to something else, and that something else is the Renaissance. Now, Renaissance is French for rebirth, and the Renaissance is an era when old ideas are being given new life, and old ways are being rediscovered and reinterpreted for a new era, literally. as for which old ideas, we'll get to that in a second. Okay. So I said the Renaissance is technically the Italian Renaissance. The fact that I qualify Renaissance with the word Italian implies that there are other non-Italian Renaissances. Yes, there were other ones. There were what are commonly called little Renaissances at various points in the Middle Ages, when European culture, like, it changed, but it didn't change enough to justify not calling it the Middle Ages anymore. So, a push forward, but not enough of a push forward for us to say, okay, we're not in the Middle Ages. So, for example, under Charlemagne, we have what is called the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne tried to create a centralized state with a genuine law code. He patronized the arts. Even though he failed and it all went to poo, there was a brief kind of surge. Charlemagne called his empire the Holy Roman Empire. He was trying for a rebirth. He was trying to rebirth the old ideas of the Roman Empire: centralized government, rule of law, a return of patronage of the arts, blah, blah, blah. He was trying to bring it back. He was trying to bring classical culture back. He failed, but we still call this a little Renaissance, a failed Renaissance, if you will. And then, as I mentioned, in the 1100s, we get what's called the 12th century Renaissance. There were universities popping up. Crusaders had brought back a bunch of essential works of Greek philosophy, and that was being taught in the universities. New styles of poetry and literature were emerging. There was a new kind of architecture called Gothic architecture that was spreading all over the place. So the 12th century, the 1100s, was a period of time in the Middle Ages where society made substantial progress. And remember, I said that was a period when we get that sort of kicks off the High Middle Ages. The 12th century Renaissance isn't enough to justify not calling this the Middle Ages anymore. But the 12th century Renaissance kicks off the process of the end of the Middle Ages. It sort of nudges things enough that it's gonna start tipping in that direction. So it's something. The 12th century Renaissance, again, it's not a Renaissance it's not enough of a change for us to say, oh, this isn't the Middle Ages anymore, but it's enough of a change to recognize that the Middle Ages are starting, we're on our way out of the Middle Ages. And it would take another, 300 years before we get completely out of the Middle Ages. But that was a beginning point. Okay, so getting back to the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, it was a big cultural shift in Europe that really and that's really the end of the Middle Ages. Like the 12th century is like, it's starting to not be as medieval anymore. Things are changing. Throughout the High Middle Ages, things are changing. And then we hit the Renaissance, and it just changes. And then we're like, you know what? This isn't even the Middle Ages anymore. So a couple of questions immediately present themselves. When did the Italian Renaissance happen? The Renaissance happen? Why did it happen? Why is it Italian specifically? And most importantly, what kind of changes are we talking about? Okay, so let's see what we can do here. So when? That's kind of tough to pin down with exactitude. Uh, but there's a bunch of things that happen in a relatively short amount of time that have these big effects on European society, and they pretty much all happen roughly around 1400 to, up through the middle of the century, 1450s, 1460s. Um, so we can kind of say the Renaissance took place in the early 1400s or maybe the mid 1400s. Let's talk about these things and give you an idea. So first of all, I talked about the Black Death in the last video, and I told you about the economic changes that were taking place after the end of the first wave of the Black Death in 1351. So basically, the changes that were taking place between 1350 and 1400. Those changes to the economic mobility of peasants coincided with a great flourishing of trade, of the development of extended trade networks in Europe, and a merchant group from like northern Central Europe, like Germany and the Netherlands, things like that, called the Hanseatic League, had a big role in that. And they kind of hit their stride, like their best point was right around 1400-ish, early 1400s. And there was even the development of a fairly modern style bank, the Medici Bank, in northern Italy. There's Italy, right? There's Italy. In northern Italy, all in the late 1300s, during the same period, from about 1350 to 1400. So that by the early 1400s, you're looking at a pretty modernized commercial economy, with banks and highly organized trade networks and trading companies and double entry bookkeeping, which we still use, the whole nine yards. Very un-medieval. So the economic changes are all in place by about 1400. So that's an early date for some of these changes that characterize the Renaissance. Starting in about 1425, there's a wave of new artistic ideas. There are people like Botticelli and Brunelleschi. Botticelli a painter, Brunelleschi an architect. And they are applying sort of new artistic techniques based on classical science and Muslim science that allow them to do like perspective drawing and more sophisticated architecture. And they're going to lay the groundwork for people in the late 1400s like Michelangelo, Raphael, Correggio, Titian, and Leonardo da Vinci. Definitely Renaissance artists by the time we get to them. Brunelleschi in particular is super important. Like I said, he used new mathematical techniques to develop things like perspective drawing and more advanced architecture. His most famous accomplishment was the dome on the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral in Florence. It's called the Duomo, the dome in Italian. And it was the largest dome that had been built in Europe since Roman times. It took from about 1420, so that's an early 1400s date for the Renaissance, to about 1461. So that brings us up to the middle of the 1400s. So that's 40 years of work. But when it was finished, basically nothing like that had existed since Roman times. And I mean that right there says, "Hey, we're bringing it back," right? Uh, because the medieval period was characterized by, initially, especially, was characterized by uh, a distinct drop off from classical culture, right? Things weren't as good as they were back when Rome was still a functioning concern. Um, and if you're able to do stuff that hasn't been done since the Roman era, that's kind of a good sign that the bad period is over, right? That the period, uh, the crappy period that followed the fall of the Roman Empire, ain't going on anymore. So Brunelleschi's dome is a very visible and tangible uh, marker of the end of the Renaissance. So that's one candidate for when it happened. Um, like I said, the economic changes that were in place by the year 1400 and the early 1400s. That's a candidate for when we can say the Renaissance happened. Um, the year 1440, a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg creates the movable type printing press, and this is huge. Now I'm going to get a little technical, but I'm going to give you the short version of why this is big. Um, Printing was not the most common way to make books in the Middle Ages. Most books were just hand copied. Monasteries had rooms that they called scriptoriums, and they were basically medieval Xerox machines. One monk would stand, if there was a book they needed copied, that they wanted to make multiple copies of, a monk would bring it into the room and stand at the front of the room and read it out loud, slowly. And lots of monks would be in the room and they would be writing as they listened to him. So they would just copy down word for word what he said, so that by the time he had finished reading the book out loud, you now have as many copies of it as there were monks in the room. Obviously, this is an incredibly slow and inefficient way to copy books, but it was the best that they had. Printing wasn't super useful because the only kind of printing they had was wooden block printing. Basically, you would carve an entire page worth of text into a block. You would coat the block with ink, and you would smoosh it down on the. You would carve out an entire page worth of text. You would coat that with ink, and you smoosh it out like a stamp on paper. You could make multiple copies this way, but again, there's only so long that a wooden stamp is going to last. You can only use it so many times before it starts to suffer wear and tear and it becomes illegible, or the results of it become illegible. And if the block was damaged, then that page is no longer, you no longer have a stamp for that page. And if you make a mistake, the carving process was laborious and exacting, and if you make a mistake, then either you have to live with the mistake or throw it out and start again, which is a huge pain in the ass. So there really weren't. There were a few printed books that had been done by this technique, but like that was an even worse way to make books than just copying them by hand. So movable type, though, and movable type would be used in some form. It would be refined slightly, but the basic technology, which was developed in 1440, the basic technology would be used right up until the time when computers took over. So I think for like 500 plus years. That's how good at technology it was. Um, so what movable type is you have individual letters, which are the type. You got little squares. Each square has a letter on it. That's the type. And you have a big metal rack with rows in it. And if you want to print a page of text, you take the letters you need, the individual letters, you form them up into the sentences, you slide them into the rack, and then you coat that with ink and you slap it down. And if you need to do a different page, then you do that as many times as you need to make all the pages you need. Then when you need a different page, you just dump all of the little letter blocks out. You get the new ones you need for the new page, and you slide them in and repeat the process. For instance, if I wanted to make a page that just had the word hello in it, I would find your H, your E, your L, and your O, and I would slide them into the rack, and then I would coat it with ink, and then if I wanted to do a different page with something else, like the word nerds, I would slide those out. I would find my N, my E, my R, my D, my S. I'd slide them in. I'd coat it with ink, and then pow! And I'd have two pages that would say hello, nerds. So anyway, hello, nerds. What's up, miscreants? Anyway. So, this was revolutionary. Not only, like, once you cast all of your letters in metal, you had everything you needed to make any book you wanted. You didn't have to carve a block specifically for each page. Whatever book you wanted to print, you just had to load it all into the thing, and then badoosh. And then if you could take them out, and you could print an entirely different page from an entirely different book, all with the same kit. And the letters, the type, thus was movable. See what I'm saying? The type, you put it in the rack, you take it out of the rack. The type, the letters, were movable. Your movable type. I've had some people confuse this and think that the printing press was portable. They thought that it meant it was a movable type printing press. That's not what movable type printing press means. It means that the typeface, the little blocks of letters, are you move them around to make the page you want, and then you whoosh. The machines were not super portable. But anyway, so movable type printing was just revolutionary. First of all, the type is metal. You can reuse it for a super long time before it shows wear and tear. And it'll still produce legible prints. And it allows you to rearrange what you're doing very easily. You can very quickly, a skilled operator can very quickly print up a given book. And you're not locked into just one book, like I said. Movable type printing was so fast and so cheap compared to the way books were made before. And that can be illustrated by how the number of books in Europe exploded when movable type printing came on the scene. In the years before the printing press, just before the printing press, early 1400s, it's estimated that there were about 30,000 books in all of Europe. 30,000 books in all of Europe. Hang on a second, I'm going to look something up real quick. So, okay. I had to look that up. The University of Oklahoma library, just to give you a sense of how many books we're talking about, or how few books we're talking about. The University of Oklahoma Library on campus down there has like way more than 30,000 books just in that one building. At least if I'm reading this information correctly, it's a little confused. But this is so by the time we get to the years just before the printing press, there's only 30,000 books in all of Europe. By 1500, that's just 60 years after the printing press was invented, Europe is estimated to have had about 10 million books. That's 300 times as many books as before the printing press. So let me make this perfectly clear. From the end of the Roman Empire to, let's say, 1400, that's 900 years, we get 30,000 books. And that assumes we're starting from zero, which probably isn't true, but go with me. We get 30,000 books, about 33 books a year on average, if we're averaging out. Then, so over 900 years, 30,000 books, 33 books a year. And then in the next 100 years, we get 9,970,000 more books, or just shy of 100,000 new books a year on average. Those numbers are a little bit bullshitty, but they're close enough to non-bullshit to give you the idea of what I'm talking about. With the printing press, new ideas could be disseminated so quickly all over Europe. Absolutely revolutionary. And there would be new ideas coming quickly. I'm going to get into that. Okay, so we're picking out like times where it's reasonable to say the Renaissance gets going. The economic changes that characterize the Renaissance, early 1400s. The new artistic achievements and techniques, early 1400s, stretching up into the mid and late 1400s. Basically, just sort of lasting through the entire period. The Duomo was completed in 1461. That's a big sign of it. The printing press, 1440. That's a huge one. That's definitely a marker of the Renaissance. But probably the best candidate, and the one that a lot of people use for when does the Renaissance happen, when does it get started, is 1453, when Constantinople fell to the Turks. Constantinople was the last outpost of the old Roman Empire. Remember, it was founded by Constantine back in the 4th century, before the Roman Empire fell. In that period of time, like just before the Roman Empire fell, where things had been crappy, and Constantinople was founded like in a time where things were getting better again, where it's like, oh, we're going to pull out of this, and then, no, didn't happen. But people were optimistic, like it looked like it might work, and then it all goes to crap again. So Constantinople had been around. It was legitimately a new capital in the Roman Empire back in the early 4th century, and it was still around 1,000 years later. They no longer spoke Latin there. They spoke Greek. It was the capital of the Byzantine Empire now, since the Rome had been gone for, a long time at this point, a long damn time. But it was still basically, despite the fact that everyone spoke Greek, and and Rome, the Roman Empire was long gone. Constantinople was really the last holdout remnant of the Roman Empire. And it had been continuously under threat by Muslim Turks that wanted to gobble up the land that it controlled for 400 years. The Byzantine Empire used to stretch down through the Levant, the areas we would call Syria and Lebanon and Israel nowadays. They had substantial holdings in what we would now call Turkey and Greece. And for 400 years, the Muslim Turks had been sort of taking bit by bit by bit. And in 1453, the Byzantine Empire was basically just Constantinople and the area right around it. And in 1453, the Turks brought the fight to an end. The long struggle that Constantinople had put up was over. The city fell to a siege with cannons. That remember back in the video about the 100 Years' War and the Black Death. By the time you get to the end of the 100 Years' War, there are cannons, and that's By 1453, there were cannons arrayed around the walls of Constantinople. So let me be clear about this. This was a city founded by a Roman emperor as a part of the Roman Empire, and it does not actually fall to enemies until the enemies get cannons. Absolute banana pants. But yeah, in 1453, it's over. And in those years right leading up to the end of Constantinople, and certainly with the end of Constantinople, there was a flood of refugees that followed the trade routes back to northern Italy, back to Florence and Venice and places like that. And those refugees, a lot of them were people who had the money to get out, which means they were skilled individuals. They were doctors and lawyers and artists and engineers and people like that. And all of these highly skilled, highly educated people, Greek-speaking people who had been educated in the heritage of Rome. They have been educated on the literature of Rome and Greece before it, the classical literature. And they landed in northern Italy in the period of time right around 1453, leading up to it and after it. And they brought with them this literature that preserved the humanistic ideas of Rome and Greece. And that learning, those ideas landed like a bombshell in northern Italy that was going to shake up everything and then spread quickly. And these new old ideas, right? Old ideas that date all the way back to Rome and Greece, new to Europe, reintroduced to Europe via the refugees from the last great city of the Roman Empire. That was going to have a massive effect. So yeah, we could say that when did the Renaissance start? Well, the economic changes to Europe that are characteristic of the Renaissance were all in place by about 1400. So that's a really early date. The revolution in art and architecture began around 1425 and would stretch throughout the 1400s. One of the major tangible accomplishments of this revolution in art and architecture was completed in 1461. That's a date you can point at. 1440, the development of the printing press which marks, like, nothing's the same after that. This is like the computer age, right? There's the period of the 20th century before computers really broke out and changed society, and the period after it, and nothing was the same after computers started to really become a thing in society. Um, this is kind of like that. Like, there's the period before the printing press and the period after it. So For King Corgi makes a really good year to point to. If someone says when did the Renaissance began, For King Corgi, not a bad choice. But For King Cookie 3, the Fall of Constantinople, there's a very persuasive case to make that if you had to pick a year when does the Renaissance begin, For King Cookie 3 is huge. Because this is basically when you get a sort of info dump. This is when you get an info dump of classical culture, like a bucket of cold water into northern Italy. That just brings with it huge changes. So when did the Renaissance happen? You got a lot of choices. For King Cookie 3 is a good one. That's my choice. So now let's put this together. We talked about when did it happen, why did it happen, why are we specifically talking about it as the Italian Renaissance, and what kind of changes. Well, with what I told you already, we can kind of see what's going on. Driven by the economic changes that we talked about, Europe was experiencing material prosperity unseen since the heyday of the Roman Empire. Life was, by this time, completely unlike it had been in the Dark Ages. Even the common people of this period, especially in northern Italy, which was very affluent, even the common people often lived a lot better than a lot of people who would have been called rich in the chaotic days right after the collapse of the Roman Empire. The art was better. The techniques were based on a Roman aesthetic, but they were executed with a new mathematical precision. Greek and Roman philosophy was back, thanks to the refugees from Constantinople. And all these new Greek and Roman philosophical ideas were spreading around Europe, and the art ideas were spreading thanks to the printing press. And all of this, sort of, at the heart of all of this, was the idea of humanism. Classical humanism. It's back, baby. So that answers the sort of what idea, what was changing. So humanism, remember, I've been harping on this since the beginning of the class almost. Humanism is the idea that humans are important and that they can know and control their world. This started, again, I went over all this when we talked about Greece. This idea really started to get traction, really started to be a thing in Achaean Greece. And it was foundational to the idea of the rule of law, and therefore to the Roman Republic as well as Greek democracy. Humanism took a hit when we get to the Roman Empire, and it basically sort of faded away completely in European culture with the collapse of Rome. And it makes sense, because nobody really felt very much like humans had a lot of control over their world in the abject chaos and violence of the Dark Ages. The relative the relative mass violence happening all over the place, um, and sort of loss of technology and learning, it's not going to convince you that humans can know and control their world. It's going to convince you that things are chaotic and random and terrible. And the medieval church taught that this world was nothing but trouble and it was something to be endured until reaching heaven. And that's what really mattered. It was all in God's hands anyway. That's not a very humans are important kind of view. So none of that is very humanistic. Culture in the wake of the collapse of Rome was not very humanistic. The humanism of the classical period had been defeated, or at least it had gone away. And that's reasonable for a world that was dominated by violence and poverty and ignorance. And it sounds like I'm being super harsh on Europe in the Dark Ages, and that's because it sucked. And I'm right to be harsh. So, but by the Renaissance, things had changed. Centralized governments are back. The rule of law is coming back. Violence wasn't gone, but it was at the very least more controlled and probably less prevalent. Classical learning was coming back and it was spreading thanks to the printing press. So a new way of looking at the world was maybe warranted. A way of looking at the world that was not based in the idea that everything is terrible and we can't wait for it to be over. That might have been a message that resonated with people in the Dark Ages, but it maybe wasn't the best, most persuasive message for a time when things were going so well. I mean, remember, Christianity, as it existed in medieval Europe, really got widespread in the Roman Empire during the everything is kind of shitty 3rd century. So again, a time period where everything looked terrible. Christianity was spreading like wildfire during that period, and the tenor of one of the reasons why it resonated was that the Christianity of that period was based in the idea that this is all really awful, but don't worry, it'll be over soon and you'll go to a better place. That was an idea that resonated in the crisis of the 3rd century back in the Roman Empire, and it was an idea that really resonated during the Dark Ages after Rome collapsed. And so Christianity was super widespread, it was super influential because it had a message that people could really get into and spoke to them when everything was terrible. And then the church consolidated itself and sort of became culturally entrenched, so that even as things got better, bit by bit, during the High Middle Ages, the church still had a very strong grip on people culturally. But by the time you get to the Renaissance, things had changed so much that the message of the church just seems so much less relevant. And remember, especially, that the church took a credibility hit during the Black Plague. And there was some other stuff that I'm not going into here, like the corruption of the monasteries and the crisis of simony, of people selling indulgences. I'm not going into that, but basically, the church exerted it consolidated its influence during a period when things were kind of terrible, and so the message of everything is terrible, but don't worry, it'll be over soon, was really, a strong message for that period. Um, and it held on to its influence as best as it could during the time when things were getting better and that message was getting less and less compelling. But then the church took some serious body blows to its authority, and so by the time you hit the 1400s, the church, the 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 core philosophy of the Christian church in Europe just wasn't doing it for a lot of people. It didn't speak to them in the same way it might have spoken to their ancestors. Um, and so, right in the midst of that, right during this time period when the church's influence and credibility was at an all-time low, boom, you've got all these classical Greek and Roman ideas dropped right there in northern Italy. And the Greeks and the Romans were lousy with philosophical ideas about the meaning of life, what society should look like, what government should look like, what it means to live a good life, how to be a good person, and so on, how to be a good citizen, etc. Um, and yeah, so you've got the refugees from Constantinople bringing over all of this stuff, dropping it in northern Italy right when the church is having its sort of worst credibility crisis that it's ever had. And this influx of new ideas gave Europe a kind of philosophical enema, if you will. Suddenly, people who were living in a world that was more civilized and literate and prosperous than it had ever been since the fall of Rome had access to philosophies of life developed for a world that was civilized and literate and prosperous. They had access to ways of thinking about their world and their life that were appropriate to the conditions they were living in. These old ideas of the classical world were coming back and reshaping society. They were being reborn. Renaissance, rebirth. They were being reborn. The thing that was being reborn was classical humanism. Renaissance means rebirth, and the thing being reborn was classical humanism. Okay, now don't get me wrong here. I'm not saying that Europeans stopped being Christians. Christianity was woven into the very fabric of European life at this point. But Christianity as a set of institutionalized rituals was woven into the fabric of European life. And it was possible to separate those rituals from a lot of the ideas. During the Renaissance, Christianity became infused with the humanist perspective of classical philosophy that would change the way that people viewed the church and the way that the church presented itself and presented the core ideas of Christianity. The bleak, everything is terrible approach that came out of the Dark Ages changed into a more optimistic, more humanistic kind of flavor of Christianity because of the changes that were taking place during the Renaissance. And this also would, it wasn't a change that was painless. This would eventually culminate in the fracturing of the medieval church and the Protestant Reformation, where suddenly the medieval church loses its monopoly on Christianity in Europe, and you get Protestant groups like Lutheranism and Lutheranism and Episcopalianism and or Anglicanism and Episcopalianism and eventually the Baptists and things like that. So anyway, but the point here is that people all over Europe were rethinking society and their place in it from top to bottom. And these new ways of life that they were crafting were just so very un-medieval that it doesn't feel right to call it the Middle Ages anymore. So if we're asking the question, when did the Renaissance happen? You've got some choices, but 1453 is a good one. Why did it happen? Well, we got a combination of the economic landscape was changing, which sort of changed society so that it no longer really resembled society in the Dark Ages, which were sort of the original basis of the Middle Ages. Also, you've got new ideas flowing out of Constantinople and into northern Italy. And then you've got the printing press, which allowed those ideas to spread like wildfire all over Europe. So that's the why did it happen. Why is it Italian specifically? Well, that's where these new ways of thinking about life and these new artistic movements were centered. They were centered in northern Italy, and that's largely because of the fact that northern Italy was on the other end of the main trade and travel route from Constantinople, so that's where the refugees wound up. And what kind of changes are we talking about? Well, the rebirth of classical humanism. Okay. So in the 1400s, the 15th century, Europe enters the Renaissance. It's hard to say like exactly when, but you can, if you're going to pick a year, 1453 is a good one. But if we're being honest, pretty much everything from 1400 up to about 1460 was everything from about 1400 to about 1450 was the transitional period. Was the period during which the High Middle Ages were giving way to the Renaissance. And 1453 is sort of like the big marquee moment. Like everything's changing. Oh, the call of Constantinople. Renaissance. Right? So, yeah, we can call it 1453. But it's important to remember that this changeover from the medieval period to the Renaissance is a process. Like I said, 1453, the fall of Constantinople, gets the attention. And it's a useful reference point to be able to because it gives you an opportunity to talk about a lot of the stuff that was, really crucial to the Renaissance. But don't get it twisted. Don't make the mistake of thinking that don't make the mistake of thinking that in 1453 this all came out of nowhere. There was a process, a period of change and of changes. And 1453 is a landmark, an incredibly important year we can point to. But it's not like everything happened all at once. And sort of the best illustration of that is that you can say, okay, we're sort of the changes that would bring Europe into the Renaissance are happening sort of 1400 through 1450. 1453 is the fall of Constantinople. That's like the high water mark of the process of changing over to the Renaissance. But Europe was definitely and undisputably no longer in the Middle Ages by no later than 1492. And that year should stand out to you for a very obvious reason. Columbus's voyage. Columbus was a terrible person, even by the standards of his time. Bear in mind, he was so horrible that they brought him back to Europe in manacles and made him stand trial and stripped him of his title and rank. I mean, that's how terrible he was. Like, we commonly think of, oh, Europeans were super racist and treated the indigenous peoples of Europe, the Americas badly. And they did, and they were, and Columbus was so terrible, even by their horribly racist standards, that they put him on trial. So I'm not saying Columbus is a good guy, but he was an important guy. And his voyage to the Western Hemisphere was, you can kind of say, the culmination of this spread of humanistic ideas during the changeover to the Renaissance. It was the ultimate result of these changes. If humanism is the idea that humans are important and can know and control their world, and yes, I'm going to keep freaking saying it, the Renaissance world is characterized by rethinking everything the medieval world thought it knew. And Columbus making contact with a world previously unknown to Europeans is about as revolutionary as you can get. If the Renaissance is about overturning all of the ideas of the Middle Ages and rethinking them and coming at the world from an entirely new viewpoint, I don't know how you get more Renaissance-y than opening up whole new parts of the world that Europe didn't even know existed. That's about as revolutionary as you can get. And certainly the kind of achievement that you can only have with a bunch of people who definitely thought they could know and control their world. No medieval society could have accomplished Columbus's voyage. So, when did the Renaissance happen? I mean, you won't go wrong if you say 1453, but honestly, a safer and more nuanced answer is it happened over the course of the 1400s. The changeover from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance period happened over the course of the 1400s. The economic changes at the leading edge, and then the new artistic trends, and then an important technological development, the printing press, that will play a huge role in the Renaissance by giving us a new way of disseminating ideas. The flow of Greek and Roman literature and philosophy and law and whatever into northern Italy because of the fall of Constantinople smack dab in the middle of the 1400s. And by 1453, there's no denying that the Renaissance is on. But then you got the completion of the Duomo in 1461. And certainly no one could deny that we are in the Renaissance by the time we hit 1492. So yeah, I think 1453 is a good answer if you want a particular year, but saying the changeover happened over the course of the 1400s is a perfectly fine and reasonable answer. That makes the 15th century a period of transition. Just like the 12th century was a period of transition out of the Dark Ages and into the High Middle Ages. You've got the early period in the Middle Ages that are the Dark Ages. Things are changing, and then changing real fast through the 1100s, the 12th century, so that by the time you get to 1200, for sure, you are in the High Middle Ages. Things are changing, bit by bit. And then from 1400 to 1500, things are changing super fast, so that by 1500, for sure, you're in the Renaissance. And what was being reborn, what was being renaissanced? Classical humanism. Ideas about the world and humanity's place in it that had been around since classical Greece, since Achaean Greece, and had been the basis of society in Achaean Greece and in the Roman Republic, and even to a certain extent during the Roman Empire. Less, but still. And even to a certain extent in the Roman Empire. And those ideas went into abeyance. They kind of faded from consciousness during the Middle Ages. But during the Renaissance, they make a comeback. And so if you've ever wondered what the Middle Ages were in the middle of, they're in the middle of the prevalence, the cultural dominance of humanism. Humanism was the core ideology, or at least a significant part of the ideology of the classical era. The classical era ends in violence and tragedy. Humanism fades into the background for about 1,000 years, and then makes a roaring comeback in the Renaissance. So the Middle Ages are literally in the middle of the periods in which humanism was the dominant way of thinking about things. Humanism was big in the classical era, and humanism is big in the Renaissance, and there was a period in between where it wasn't big. The Middle Ages, literally. So that's it. With the transition out of the Middle Ages, out of the medieval period, and into the Renaissance, you have a society that doesn't look very feudal anymore. It has a bunch of the stuff that's left over from feudalism, like knights and, barons and dukes and all that stuff. But that's just set dressing. That doesn't mean you live in a feudal society. I mean, England still has barons and dukes and a king and stuff like that, and that's not a feudal society. They just kept the set dressing around. You've got, it's not a feudal society anymore. Power is centralized, especially in England and France. It's centralized with powerful kings who rule as absolute monarchs. They have complex, sophisticated bureaucracies that operate by the rule of law that would not have looked out of place in the days of Rome. They have they have a public sphere and public institutions, which you don't get in a feudal society, a truly feudal society. They've got professional armies that do the fighting, so that the people who run society anymore are a warrior class in name only. They are now effectively civilian administrators. They are still, I mean, there's still a lot of lip service to them as leaders in warfare, and they command armies, especially the king, but it is not the nobility that is doing the fighting in any meaningful sense. So the class of people that run everything is no longer a warrior class, and that's not very feudal. That's not very medieval. Trade is healthy and widespread and long range. And urban populations are booming. New technologies are flourishing. There's a sense of national identity, especially in England and France, that has that has displaced the localism that is definitive of a feudal society. We're in a new world. We're in a new era, the Renaissance. Old ways of thinking, old philosophies that are more appropriate for this era are making a comeback. The rebirth of classical humanism. Oh yeah, and the medieval church, the very core ideas of the medieval church are undergoing reinterpretation and redevelopment, and the institutions of the medieval church are showing cracks and are going to crumble hard real soon. That's the Renaissance. Whole new period. Very different world from the Middle Ages. A very different world from the Dark Ages in particular, and the High Middle Ages were a period of the Dark Ages Europe being not that dark anymore and moving bit by bit towards what will become Renaissance Europe. So there we are. That brings us to an end of the class, because Humanities 2 picks up with the Renaissance and takes you all the way through, I think, the early modern period. So the early 20th century, which is bonkers. But it's still less time period than I had to cover. I had to cover 5,000 years of history. Humanities 2 only has to deal with like 400. That's not fair. And then Humanities 3, which I'm not even sure it's called Humanities 3 anymore, but they've only got to deal with like 100 years of history. Well, golly. Anyway. So that's it. That brings us to an end. Hopefully, you've gotten something out of this class. Hopefully you just sort of have a little more perspective about our history, and in particular, the big ideas that shape our history and that play a role. Oh, hi, Elias wants to be there for the ending of things. Wants to be there for the end of the class. Hi, Elias. The appearance of Elias is the main way you know that it's the Renaissance. That's when you know that Europe is transitioning from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, when Elias shows up. True fact. True fact. You can put that on the cask. Please don't. That was a joke. As sure as I say you can put it on the cask, someone is going to. That was a joke. Don't put that on the cask. Anyway. Alright. Morgan is napping, so they can't say goodbye to you. Oh, okay. Morgan heard me and woke up enough to wave goodbye. I won't turn the camera. Morgan will get mad at me. And Elias showed up to say goodbye. So this is it. Love you all. I'm rooting for you. Hope you had a good time. Hope you go on to great things. Take care of yourself. He was off the table. All right. Okay, we're good. We're take care. Bye. We're done.